an increase in the level of homelessness in their local communities in the last year, particularly in cities. The issue of homelessness is increasingly garnering national attention, with policymakers lamenting that there seems to be no end in sight to the crisis. However, local organizations in many cities are working to rise to the challenge, implementing new approaches and collaborating with city, state, and federal agencies to meet the needs of unhoused people. Here at the Terwilliger Center, we're interested in highlighting successful interventions and innovative new programs that hold lessons for policymakers and stakeholders at all levels of government as they work to promote housing stability and address the crisis of homelessness in the country. To that end, today we will hear from representatives of nonprofits, social ventures, and lead agencies in continuums of care in large cities. If you'd like to learn more about today's speakers and their work across the country, I encourage you to read our recently published interactive blog post, which you can access via a link that will be made available in the chat. So we're very lucky to have with us some great speakers today, including Preston Cochran, CEO of the planned supportive housing community, The Other Side Village in Salt Lake City, which focuses on housing and supporting people experiencing chronic homelessness. Also, we have Chris Contreras, Chief Program Officer at Brilliant Corners, a nonprofit organization that provides housing and housing-related services to those transitioning from or at risk of homelessness or institutionalization across multiple cities in California. We also have Carolyn Ross, President and CEO of All Chicago Making Homelessness History, the lead organization in the Chicago Continuum of Care, which works to prevent and end homelessness through emergency rental assistance, community partnerships, data analytics, and trainings and research. And last but not least, we have Lance Gillian, currently a partner at Waterman Steele Real Estate Advisors and formerly the chair of the Houston Coalition for the Homeless, the lead agency of the homelessness response system in the Harris, Fort Bend, and Montgomery counties, which works to unite partners and maximize resources to move people experiencing homelessness into permanent supportive housing. Thank you all so much for joining us. Before I go into any questions, if you're watching this live, do submit any of your own questions for our panel at any time. You can post them in the chat if you're watching on YouTube, and we'll get to them near the end of the event. So to kick things off, I'd like for each of you to briefly talk about the work you and your organizations do to reduce homelessness and address the needs of unhoused people. And so I can kick it off with Preston.
Yeah, hello. The Other Side Village was founded on the conviction that housing alone will never solve homelessness, but community will. And the Village is a healing community that provides affordable housing, restores dignity, fosters self-sufficiency, and provides work opportunities for the residents that lead to a happy and purposeful life. So everyone will have a home and a sense of belonging, and it's the community that brings them together.
Thanks so much, Preston. Chris, you can go next.
Hi, yes, thanks for having me. My name is Chris Contreras. I'm the Chief Program Officer at Brilliant Corners. We're a supportive housing agency in the state of California and currently support over 8,000 program participants statewide. And we focus on the housing piece, which is really focused on landlord engagement, and really believe that there is housing available out there for people that are currently unhoused, and are really focused on strategies that look at scaling up using that housing.
Thank you, Chris. Carolyn.
Great. Good morning, everybody. All Chicago Making Homelessness History is the lead agency, as Francis mentioned, the lead agency for our continuum of care here in the city of Chicago. But also we have an expanded role in just trying to help move the system and defining the parts of the system that are needed at the table to try to talk about these issues so that we ultimately can prevent and end homelessness. We've had a tremendous week here in Chicago this week with just aligning our local plans with the federal all-in plan provided by the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, as well as working with our state leadership, which I can talk about a little bit later, just some pretty remarkable things that have been happening. We try to bring all of the key pieces that partners to the table who work in areas, mental health, addiction, gender-based violence, the criminal justice system that often leads to homelessness, so that we have expertise from those sides to understand what are the things that are kind of leading to this issue. So we're extremely pleased to be here today and happy to share.
Thank you, Carolyn. Happy to have you. And Lance? Oh, Lance, you might be on mute.
You knew one of us would fumble. Sorry about that. Anyway, good morning. I am the immediate past chair of the Coalition for the Homeless, Houston Harris County. Our coalition effectively is the lead agency for our COC, and as I like to refer to it, as the air traffic controller for our homeless response system here in Houston. Unlike everyone else here and on the panel this morning, I'm truly a volunteer. I don't have the technical skills, but I do like to talk about our coalition's success, and that success really being the reflection of collaboration. We've been blessed with tremendous support from both our city, our county, and as well as remarkably galvanizing philanthropy, and then scale. So I'm happy to visit about that this morning, but our numbers have, even through COVID, been very encouraging. Our success in dealing with homelessness here in Houston and those who work around us, we've experienced outcomes better than most.
Thank you, Lance, and thanks to all our other speakers. And as we go into questions, I'll direct them individually, but please feel free to answer, to reply to each other's statements. We want this to be as dynamic and engaging as possible. So with that, I'll kick it off with Chris. So your organization, Brilliant Corners, as you mentioned just now, it partners with landlords as well as with government and service providers to provide supportive housing for unhoused people. One thing we really want to emphasize in this conversation and future work we do on the issue is just what are some key lessons for coalition building and bringing different actors to the table to achieve results on the issue of homelessness. You can share your insights.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Francis. It's such an important one. I think coordination is so key to scaling homeless services solutions in all of our communities. And the fact is that it is extremely difficult to do so, especially in markets like Los Angeles, where there are a lot of different players and a lot of different funding coming to bear. We at Brilliant Corners are most known for operating the Flexible Housing Subsidy Pool, which is a specific model that looks to really establish a central hub where all types of stakeholders, whether it be landlords or funders, and of course participants, can access housing. And we really do believe that centralizing core parts of your system around community-based organizations that can scale up the placement of people experiencing homelessness into housing out in the community is really important. So what we've been able to do with that model is that we've been able to allow our community to tap our infrastructure to immediately operationalize funding that is coming to bear in our community. So we partner, for instance, in Los Angeles with the Department of Health Services, the Department of Mental Health, the Office of Diversion and Reentry. And the fact is that they can come to us to coordinate their resources and don't need to themselves just establish their own housing program that's sort of off to the side, not sort of coordinated with everybody else in the system. So I think that's one of our biggest sort of takeaways, is that whenever communities can coordinate by centralizing key services and really professionalizing the act of housing location out in our communities, that by far is what helps scale placements across continuums.
Thanks, Chris. That's very insightful. And I want to stay on that theme of operationalizing funding and finding really important and dynamic partnerships, and move over to Lance. So Houston has received a lot of praise in recent years for its reduction in homelessness. And there's a New York Times article recently came out highlighting that one of the key things that in Houston's strategy was precisely that they got a lot of different kinds of actors rowing in the same direction. So public agencies as well as COC organizations and other nonprofits. So could you speak a little bit to the role of the COC in Houston and other organizations in building that kind of coalition between actors to be able to achieve material results in your city?
Well, I appreciate it. Michael Kimmelman at the New York Times was very, very gracious and generous to our city. And I know everyone read the article because I showed up in the last paragraph, which was 25,000 words into it. But that's really been the key to our success in Houston. And it dates back to Michelle Obama, First Lady Obama's, and Anise Parker's leadership in 2011, we were given the instruction, and at the time I was chair of the Houston Housing Authorities Board, we were given the instruction to get our act together, create a system where we went to the people. They didn't have to come to us. You didn't have to wander around our entire city trying to find resources when you had no mobility as someone who was unhoused, and to figure it out. And we were originally given that directive using VASH vouchers, and we found success. And we found the success in collaboration between the different groups. The major change in our community's effort, that when it reset a number of years ago, this is about 2016, was a collaboration between the city and county. And admittedly, we had politics come into play for the first time. We had both the city and the county. Although our elections are technically nonpartisan, they both became value aligned, primarily Democrats. And our mayor and our county judge and the bodies that support them began to work together. And that was the major shift in not only how we used our resources, but even when it came to federal funding, as those funds became collaborative and came and invested together. It also was, and we've now announced this, we've received a $10 million gift from one of our largest philanthropic donors in the city. That would not have come but for the collaborative efforts of our
Thanks, Lance. So on the topic of federal funding and how to really make it come into play, I really want to get to Carolyn, because I know in earlier this year, your organization Chicago received, or is one of the recipients of, a $60 million grant from the Department of Housing and Urban Development as part of a broader initiative to address unsheltered homelessness. So would also love to get your take on how to best deploy these kinds of federal funds, both existing streams like Lance mentioned, right, HUD vouchers, but as well these kind of new fundings that are being made available through new initiatives to uniquely allow organizations like All Chicago to pursue their strategies to reduce unsheltered homelessness.
Thank you. Absolutely. We're just ecstatic here to have this type of boost in resources, but even more so in partnership. We have been watching and learned from our friends in Houston and in LA and other parts of the country to just, we should be talking more about what's working and what's not. And that's really what led to our involvement and working with our continuum of care, which I should mention, we have 43 funded partners within the continuum responsible for about 140 different projects. And so that's a lot to move around. And so having HUD come in and support what we've been seeing and trying to plan to try to address a lot of lessons learned during the pandemic has just been, it's been tremendous. And it's really kind of given us a renewed approach. So the $60 million grant is $20 million over 3 years. We've worked very closely with our partners at the city, of course, with the continuum of care and with our state partners to just kind of, what's going on? What are we seeing? And so clearly we do not have enough shelter beds. And that's okay in a sense, in relation to the fact that we all agree that shelter should be short-term, temporary, and non-recurring. We really want to make the push to move from unsheltered homelessness to transition on then more permanent housing. And so through this grant and our planning, which was a huge mountain to move because we like voices to be involved in the planning of this, particularly those with the expertise. But there's a couple of things that we're going to be focusing on. First and foremost, we want to have a more robust outreach effort so that our outreach teams have immediate access to triage and stabilization housing. For some people we know in unsheltered homelessness, triage housing and enhanced support are extremely important. So during the pandemic, it was quite a rush to work with folks who were considered unsheltered to get them out of encampments and off the streets into safe places. And so 2 things we developed. One was called an expedited housing initiative to try to get people housed more quickly. And we did it by 2 ways. One, accelerated moving events. We went to the encampments, to unsheltered locations, working with our outreach teams, to get people immediately into what shelter beds were available, into hotels to ensure their safety. And this was really for us in the beginning a health issue as far as the pandemic was concerned. The second thing we did is we really started to garner a cadre of effort in seeking out additional landlords. We do not have enough housing, and by far not enough affordable housing here in Chicago or the state of Illinois. And so it's important for us to really work with those landlords. We also want to work with our peer support. As I mentioned, our members of lived expertise are represented on the continuum. They're even represented on All Chicago's board of directors. We have a lived experience commission and a youth advisory board, all who have given input into this planning. The whole point is to enhance our system-wide coordination. Know what the right hand knows what the left hand is doing. And we're working following the strategic path of, as I mentioned earlier, our plan to prevent and end homelessness aligned with the All-In plan, and in Illinois, the Home Illinois plan, which all talks about how we all want to work to end homelessness. So we're extremely excited to have this. It aligns with our continuum's effort to try to grab as many pieces as we possibly can, and to just be authentic and honest with each other that we don't have enough housing available. And so there are going to be some efforts to continue to work with the city to try to help develop that.
Thank you, Carolyn. Now I want to pivot to Preston. Your organization, of course, is interesting and slightly different from some of the others here, particularly Carolyn's being the lead of the Chicago Continuum of Care, in that the Other Side Village is operating in part, and do correct me if my reading is wrong, as a social enterprise model, but also with a lot of support from city funding, as well as a pre-existing nonprofit, which is the Other Side Academy. And so you're sort of bringing a different approach to addressing homelessness, perhaps at a more local level, according to the Other Side Village, you aim to make it replicable across the country and eventually be able to share some best practices with other cities. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the advantages of that model that you're using, that integrates an aspect of social enterprise, and why you believe it has the potential to be replicated and scaled up in other locations.
Yeah, thank you. So the Other Side Village is a new venture, and the Other Side Academy, which you mentioned, has been around for about 10 years. We have locations in both Salt Lake City and Denver, Colorado. It's a 30-month training school where students learn about social, vocational, and life skills, allowing them to emerge with a healthy life on the other side, is what we call it. And this program is available for those as an alternative for individuals facing long-term incarceration, or those that are seeking a change from the life they've chosen in the past. So many of our students have been incarcerated 20 or more times. They've been homeless, substance abusers, both men and women from all ages. So it's a 30-month program. And what we've done is take that model and looked at the homeless population and how do we use that same approach for the Other Side Village. And the way that the Other Side Academy is funded, it doesn't rely on any grants or funds from state or federal. It's all run, and operations are run by the funds generated from the social enterprises that we start. So a couple of the ones that are up and running, we've got the Other Side Moving and Storage Company. The moving company is the #1 rated moving company in Utah, has been for the past several years. And these are where our students work. We believe in strong work ethic, and it's a way of healing. It's part of our healing process. So in addition to our moving company and storage company, we have several thrift boutiques, large volume, high-end thrift boutiques. We also launched the Other Side Donuts, which is one of our new ventures. So we are making donuts every day and delivering those to local businesses and businesses and corporations. We have an arrangements and plants company. And part of the village is we're building what we're calling the Community Inn. And those are Airbnbs where individuals that are coming into the city of Salt Lake, they can rent those, stay in the village where our residents are living, those that have been chronically homeless. and we'll rent those on a day-to-day or weekly basis as a way to generate revenue. So all the profits generated by our businesses make our program self-supportive. And so once those infrastructures, once the village infrastructure has been built and those businesses become profitable, we will no longer rely on any grants or donations to fund any ongoing operations. So as the village reduces the number of homeless people in our community, there will be fewer tax dollars that will be spent on homeless services. In addition, we're giving jobs to individuals that traditionally may have had a hard time because of their past getting jobs and being able to keep those jobs. So we know it works. We know the model works. It's been working for 10 years, and we're looking at, and we've been contacted by all sorts of cities to replicate this in their communities, which we're happy to share and have shared. But we believe that that meaningful work component is really important to the overall healing process. And obviously we tailor it to their abilities in terms of what they can do on a day-to-day basis, but looking at from a functional lifestyle. And that's part of the whole village component. How we work with the academy and village work in tandem, even though we may serve a little bit of different population.
Thank you, Preston. So I've heard a few themes kind of across the board in all your responses. There's themes of collaboration with landlords, themes of addressing the needs of particular populations within the unhoused community, such as folks that are recently incarcerated, as well as a connection to the housing crisis more broadly, the crisis of the lack of affordable housing across the country. So I want to sit with that third one a little bit. Of course, the Terwilliger Center here in BPC is very strongly focused on that topic, and would really just love to get a little bit more from each of you on how you understand the connection between homelessness and housing affordability or the lack thereof in your particular communities. So we've seen recent research, identify strong correlations between rent burdens and a rate of homelessness in different places in the country. But yeah, would really appreciate just getting a sense of how each of you think about this and how your organizations approach that topic. And also if you have any recommendations for how policymakers at any levels could address the issue of homelessness and housing at the same time, perhaps through incentivizing the construction of more affordable homes, or if you have any particular recommendations on that front. So I can start it off with Carolyn.
Sure, thank you. I don't know how we can talk about this issue without connecting the two. In Chicago, clearly it's one of our cities in the United States that is probably of higher expense in regards to living and cost of living. I think one message I would want our decision makers and legislators to keep reminding themselves is people who experience homelessness are our neighbors. These are not people from a different place. They want the same things that most of us want in the sense of safe communities, good, safe housing. Affordability is so key. The amount of emergency assistance that we assisted the state and the city to allocate out to individuals is overwhelming, and it came from all parts of the city. And so we watch this very closely because one of the things that we started talking about, actually just even this week, having some local conversations about this issue, we have too limited research that we rely on that often leads to the limitation of resources. We have to broaden that stroke and not just talk about who's coming and seeking assistance, who we're seeing, but to do more research on the end of what people are asking for and what they need. We have veterans in our encampments here. We have a lot of people that are very transitional who are from other states. But if they come here to Illinois, it's clear we've put ourselves out there as a welcoming state. So we don't really care where you come from. If you're here and you're seeking assistance, you fit into that. The other piece about affordability is everybody can't live in the beautiful spaces downtown, seeing the sky, the skyline. So we have to find a way to promote more of the use of scattered site housing. This whole concept of congregate care, in my opinion, has kind of got us in trouble in the first place with public housing. The past history that you've heard about, the concrete buildings that were built for our housing authority, all of that has been dissolved. And and folks have been engaged in scattered site housing, and I would really encourage that. Housing is a big issue. Our office is close to the west end of downtown, and when the pandemic came, we saw things shut down, and it wasn't just because of the pandemic, but people lost jobs. And we were pretty amazed with where some of the requests for assistance were coming from throughout the city, and just not limited to poor folks. It was people who were really in a tight situation. So we cannot do this work without talking about those two issues and to help plan for that, because at this point, we know that we don't have enough housing available. In Illinois, there are close to 11,000 people who actually seek assistance for homelessness. We know the number is bigger, but more than half of that is accounted for here in Chicago and Cook County surrounding suburbs. So we have a very good relationship with our Department of Housing, and we want to continue to build upon that because they're listening and trying to work to that end.
Thank you, Carolyn. I can keep naming names, but also if people want to jump in, I am particularly interested. I think, Chris, you mentioned earlier that you found that like the housing and the places that you're operating is there. It's just a matter of providing the support that unhoused people might need to be able to access it. Of course, California is sort of very well known as a ground zero for issues of housing affordability. So certainly appreciate your take on this.
Yeah, no, thanks. Like you said, there's an affordability crisis throughout this country, and especially in California. And what we would say is that, you know, whether it comes to creating new housing, building new housing, or accessing current housing, the only way to get past that is to provide people with rental subsidies, like housing choice vouchers at a federal level. More of those would allow people to access current scattered site housing, like Carolyn was speaking about, but also would allow developers, either market rate or light tech, to actually go through the process of building more housing if they could access more subsidies. The reality is that it's not just homeless people that are dealing with an affordability crisis. We've spent a lot of time talking here in California about the fact that a lot of the people that are working in the sector trying to solve homelessness day in and day out themselves are struggling with housing affordability and are one, you know, incident away from, you know, not being able to afford housing. So I think that should be very glaring to all of us. And I think anything that we can be doing to increase, you know, both services, funding that's appropriated for services and subsidies is really the key to solving that right now.
I would add too, if I could just jump in here. So we all are familiar with the term housing first, and Utah was among the early adopters of this approach. We saw the excitement for that approach fade over time, and over time, some of those properties became unsafe and crime-ridden. And for many individuals experiencing homelessness, it became a less attractive option than street camping, especially in Salt Lake. We're seeing that right now in our metro. And so by contrast, with our approach with the village is we believe the missing component in the Housing First initiative was having too little emphasis on emotional support, behavioral accountability, self-reliance, and rebuilding that inner self-worth. And so as much as an unhoused person needs a roof over their head, they need to be surrounded by people who truly care about them, believe in them, keep them accountable, and have faith in their ability to achieve their full human potential. And so instead of just plucking someone off the streets and immediately dropping them inside a home or a shelter or a group home that they're unprepared to sustain, the village brings them into what we call the Village Prep School. And this is a group home where individuals and candidates make major life changes in preparation for life in the village community. And it's the first stage of our two-part approach. So many of our village candidates suffer from mental health disorder. And so we take a whole person approach to help stabilize our residents. We provide professional clinical counseling and peer-to-peer. It's a peer-to-peer therapeutic community model, which we know has been used for decades around the world to help those with significant mental health challenges. And so those are some of the same principles that are different than the Housing First that we're using in the village, and are behind the success of the Other Side Academy as well.
If you don't mind, and Preston, let me jump in. I'm a huge fan of your model, and particularly Community First Village in Austin has been a great example of, I think, of a similar approach. In Houston, we are very much a housing first approach. And unfortunately, in Texas, some of our politics have become difficult for the unhoused community, and we always have to qualify. Housing first isn't just handing someone a set of keys, a furnace department, wishing them good luck. That's not how we look at it. We look at I always refer to as housing first plus, because it comes with the level of support that each individual resident needs. Ironically, and again, Caroline, to your point, our driving value is to ensure that homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring. That being said, the affordability issue in Texas, and particularly in Houston, is an odd one, and that although housing prices have gone up and the cost of housing has increased, we actually have the capacity to house our unhoused. Our existing apartments and other housing options are sufficient in quantity. We have about 4,000 folks, 3,500 to 4,000 folks on any given day, and that's an unacceptable number, but still a very different number than we used to have, who are unhoused. We have that many vacant apartments in Houston. So our issue has become how do we connect that population with the existing capacity in a state where source of income discrimination is legal. And that's not something I'm proud of. In fact, I'm ashamed by that, but that's a choice our state legislator made a while back. Our coalition has worked aggressively to find solutions to whether it's master leasing apartments where the coalition takes responsibility, and we're just working on that now. We take the responsibility for the lease and then sublease out to our client, the resident needing housing, so the landlord is not in that direct relationship with someone who may have credit impairments, may have other challenges, and the landlord's reluctant to do that. We're looking at property tax exemptions that are part of our Texas code in order to incentivize a landlord to kind of give them an extra boost to a voucher, to require that certain percentage of units are set aside for those who are unhoused. Again, it's a private sector approach to it. And then the other way we're looking at it is, although we have these great federal resources, and they've been very, very impactful to us, Caroline, also in our coalition, our city and county gifted us with $100 million, $30 million a year for 3 years from ARPA funds. And I feel like we've been great stewards of that. We've had the impact we wanted. Those funds, as we all know, will be gone at the end of next year. And finding other solutions and finding private sector solutions where we're not necessarily dealing with competing public policies, but finding solutions where we can incentivize the private sector outside of LIHTC or bonds or direct investment of federal funds to use our existing resources and then create new ones to provide housing options. So we've looked at a number of different solutions of how to deal with affordability, but we as a community have the capacity. We literally, if every apartment complex in Houston, and we're working on this literally, would set aside 1 unit for someone who's unhoused, and I appreciate the difficulties of that and scale and providing services, we would have enough apartments to house everyone who's on the street tonight or in a shelter tonight. And so we have a very different problem. So we're working very as a private sector, and that's been a collaboration here in Houston that we've been very, very blessed with. Our board is about 50% business people and 50% community people. And I don't see that across the country necessarily. Our business community has been very impactful. And I'm just a business guy. I'm a real estate guy. Who this is just an important space and value to me, like my peers on our board.
Thank you, Lance. And that's actually a perfect segue to another question I wanted to ask, and that you've all engaged with this to some extent already. But so here at the Terwilliger Center, we do a lot of thinking as to how to best recruit the sort of the private sector in achieving goals of providing affordable housing. Particularly, we do a lot of work on how to incentivize landlord participation in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And this is one of several initiatives. But we're certainly very interested, and I'm sure our audience also is interested in hearing a little bit more about, as the giant wave of federal funding that became available as a function of the pandemic starts dwindling down, and perhaps there's a need to find new sources of support, like you mentioned, Lance. What are some of these creative arrangements, either with private sector or perhaps even nonprofit institutions, that you're finding, your organizations are finding in your own cities? And I know Chris might have some interesting points to make here, so I would love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, no, thanks. This is something that we focus on every day, landlord engagement. So I think three different things come to mind for me. One is really funding that allows you to specialize in the procurement of housing, which is basically getting professionals that are focused on landlord engagement and housing location. And too many times that falls on our social workers or case managers in the system, when in reality, that's a specialized sort of field to go out there and work with real estate holders out in the community. So I think that that's one thing that we really believe in. The second thing is flexible funding for landlord incentives. So similarly here in LA, what we do is we really take a pooled approach to our housing unit. So we go work with landlords, and we have the ability to literally enter into a holding agreement with a landlord today to hold that unit in anticipation of one of our program participants moving in. So if, Francis, you had a vacant unit here in LA, we could go inspect it today, convince you to participate in our program through our wraparound services, and take that unit off the market, which I think we really believe in. And then the last thing is you need flexible funding for things like security deposits and move-in assistance and damage mitigation. The reality is that it's not just about placing people into housing and then hoping for the best. It's really about wrapping around services and being really willing to expend money when it's needed to really support both our participants and landlords out in the community. So there's an array of incentives, but the reality is that we need to work with landlords. We need to have them at the table, and that's really important to scaling solutions.
If I could, Francis, I just want
to
go on that because thank you, Chris. You all are one of the programs that we learned from in regards to landlord engagement. It was very important because we needed to find units and find them fast. And I just want to remind folks, when we look at homelessness, we look at it as the outcome of other unaddressed and unresolved issues. And so you're absolutely right. A house and a key just doesn't do it for folks. There's a reason why. It's not that this was their choice. Something in their life, some event occurred or events occurred to lead them there. The landlord engagement piece is so important. One, to say, these are your neighbors. Because they have the label of homelessness does not mean that you're not already dealing with people who already have challenges. You just don't know it. And the other piece is finding incentives or ways to incentivize landlords to do this. Helping them understand if someone comes to their home where they're living after they just got placed there and they punch a hole in the wall, let's pull the case manager in and have a conversation because maybe they lost something that day. They could have lost their job or it's just something. And so having the mitigation fund to be there so that is the solution as opposed to automatic ejection from the living space. And so I'm just so pleased to hear it because for us to hear the echo of things that we're trying here in Chicago, that they're already going on in other parts of the state. In fact, we've reached out to learn about them is awesome. That means we're more collective and more aligned than we probably knew.
Francis, if I could ask a question, take your job.
Please go ahead.
Because I'm curious, Chris, it sounds like y'all have done an amazing job with landlord engagement. And your comment about getting a landlord to hold a unit, that's one of the common complaints we hear about, what takes time. Are you able to pay the landlord from that day forward while you do your role in matching the client with the unit? And that sounds awfully clinical, and it's not meant to be, but still, that's the money thing we run into in our community.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, Lance. That's exactly what we do. So we operationalize both local subsidies and we try to leverage federal housing choice vouchers, for instance, or emergency housing vouchers. So we take units and literally start paying rent so a landlord does not have any vacancy loss while we're going through the process of both locating a tenant to move in, but also going through the process of moving in. And a landlord still has the ability to screen a tenant, although we, of course, have been very upfront about what we're trying to do as a community-based program. When we're paying a local subsidy, that process can happen very quickly. Now, one of the largest complaints that we hear about federal resources is how long and burdensome the process can be to go through the motions of utilizing a housing authority voucher, unfortunately. So that vacancy coverage allows us to sort of mitigate that for a landlord and take that reason for not participating in a program away. So we've found huge success in it. And the last thing I'll say is that this does take money. I think funders are oftentimes, surprised about how much it might take on the front end to help somebody move into housing. But the reality is that everything takes resources right now, and those resources are better spent there on the front end than not securing housing for somebody in the long term, right? So that's a real important thing that funders need to get behind.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Just going back to something from Carolyn's response earlier on the topic of really communicating to landlords as well as broader communities that unhoused people are their neighbors and not just a problem to be solved. Preston, I know that the Other Side Village has had to engage with Salt Lake City residents in the west side of the city where it's being cited to ensure that there's local community support for the project and to address community concerns about citing like a supportive housing community where they live. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit to how you approach those conversations and helping show the community near the project that, of course, unhoused people are their neighbors.
Absolutely. I mean, anytime you're dealing with supportive housing or homelessness, there's always going to be some level of NIMBYism and individuals who have, obvious concerns, as anyone would. I think one of the luxuries we've had in operating the Other Side Academy, if you can imagine a community, one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city, and all of a sudden we say we want to buy an old mansion and place up to 150 individuals who have been, ex-convicts and incarcerated right there in your neighborhood across the street. And over time, we have proven that our model works, and we have lots of different allies and supporters of the Other Side Academy. And so to be able to have them as allies and recruiting them to help in our pre-development public relations from the Other Side Village component, first and foremost is you got to listen. You got to listen to every stakeholder, business community, neighbors, schools, you name it. You've got to go out and do the pre-development, do the work, and listen to what their fears are, what their objections are, understand their biases, and then really educate the community on what you're trying to accomplish. And we did open houses. We held open houses to try to build goodwill. We invited them to come in and help, serve a meal or volunteer and do different things and just rub shoulders with those who are benefiting from our programs and services and get to know them on a one-to-one basis. And so showcasing our past work, but really addressing all legitimate opposition. You've got traffic, you've got project design, you've got crime that you've got to deal with, and really bringing everyone from a collective impact approach together at the table. And having those open houses, I think, really helps to get people to see behind the door and be able to interact with the individuals who are in the programs and receiving services. But once you've got to persevere, and once that opposition diminishes, typically soon after you get approval, but having to go through the city council and public sessions and public opinions and everything else, it takes a lot of time. And so you just got to be patient and really, focus on recruiting those allies and individuals who believe in it, because it does work. It's difficult to cite anything, whether it's a homeless shelter, which I've had to go through too, and that has its challenges, to the other side village, which is housing for the homeless. But to be able to showcase, past work and what you're doing and make them part of the solution, make them part of the conversation and bring them in, I think is really helped us get to where we are today.
Thank you, Preston. I have a lot of other questions, but I just want to make sure our audience is aware. You can drop any questions you have in the YouTube chat and we can pull them up here and ask our panelists. So I do encourage you to do that so we can ask a few audience questions by the end of the event. So pivoting a little bit, one of the issues generally with addressing homelessness that I'm sure all of you have encountered is the difficulty of generating quality data. Of course, there's the point in time counts that the federal government uses, but even HUD and other agencies acknowledge that there are difficulties in collecting that information. So Carolyn, your organization makes a point that it works to do data analysis and to help other partners achieve sort of better quality data to track homelessness in Chicago. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about data-driven approaches and metrics that can be used to measure the effectiveness of homeless reduction programs at the local level.
Sure, absolutely. There's so much to talk about in this space. I'll try to stay focused because we can talk about this all day, right? So as the lead for the continuum of care, All Chicago serves as what they call the collaborative applicant or the lead agency. We've recently taken on coordinated entry, which we refer to as the front door, as well as the HMIS system, which is the management information system to track and to be able to identify and gather data on those who actually access the system by requesting assistance. By no means do we dispute the fact that those numbers are not accurate, don't accurately capture what we're truly experiencing in the city, but it gives us a start. And what I've learned being here, we have more contact with our researchers and universities and those types of engines because people want to know. I mean, we have to make good decisions based on good data. So recently we've talked about elevating the conversation and the prioritization of youth homelessness. And one of the problems that we're running into, or just as trying to provide services, I'm sure all of my colleagues here are familiar with, the federal and the state funding sometimes and the definitions that come along with it are not aligned to provide those incentives, the extra things that we need to get these types of programs launched. But I will give credit to the HMIS format because it is one of the most, at least consistent bodies of work where we can continually go back to it. You can go on our website and we run a daily dashboard of how many people have accessed the system, all of the demographics. We're extremely interested, of course, in diversity, equity, and inclusion, because in Chicago, in our system, we are consistently over 80% as far as the amount of Black residents who are accessing this system. And they are typically male, African Americans, and often again, members who are also returning returning citizens coming back from institutionalization in the criminal justice system. So we share a lot of that information. There are some local efforts where we are working, we worked through something called the Roadmap Initiative, where we were trying to identify the high-end users, connecting our data with health systems, the criminal justice system, the school system. It's a daily struggle just because as you're waiting for one set of data, maybe some time goes past and then it just kind of sometimes seems irrelevant. We are not giving up though, because I think it's really important for us to understand we keep complaining about all these people who are coming and accessing the system. And I think we're going to find that many of these folks, we're all touching them. And that's what led to my comment earlier about these are our neighbors who are just crying out for help. That's why they keep bouncing through one system and the next. And so we've got to be very, very aware of that. And then finally, just talking about this, for those things that are federal and our government funding that it doesn't cover, we have a very strong partnership here with our public-private efforts. We have a local philanthropic group made up of over 30 partners, the Chicago Funders Together to End Homelessness. And they have been such a great partner in being able to help plug some of those holes that go beyond, great, we got a placement, we got a voucher. Now we need different things. They need to have treatment paid for. They need to get access and making sure that they have their medications if that's relevant to their situation. And so the data is really important. We would love to have more effort, and we're seeking out support to try to figure out how we can get these different systems to talk to each other. Because again, I think we're dealing with many of the same folks, or at least there's so much to learn from this.
Thank you, Carolyn. And on that topic of additional support, I'll loop back to that at the very end of the conversation, but I do want to bring in some audience questions. So I think we have an audience questions from Yvonne, who asks, and this is a general question, whoever wants to answer, what experience do you have with encampment clearings, and how can cities and service organizations balance concerns about health and safety surrounding encampments? I'm assuming balancing them with of course, the housing needs of folks who live in encampments.
I'm happy, and I don't do that work, but I can speak to the success we've had, and I'm happy to share offline after the meeting our resources. But we have been very sensitive about when we engage encampments, and we have some significant encampments, nothing to the scale of Los Angeles, of course, I say. But we've actually been very successful in rehousing those. Those encampments have been an opportunity for us to engage large populations, develop data through the HMIS system. And then we've had about an 82% success rate. And that's only after 2 years. We need to do a better job of monitoring success, but an 82% success rate and rehousing and maintaining housing for those in encampments. So our encampment strategy has been acclaimed, I guess, is one way to put it. Again, it's work our staff has done that's remarkable. And we've done that in collaboration with the business community. The folks in Austin said, I can't believe you let the business community influence your encampment strategies. I said, of course we do. They contribute a significant amount of money towards the encampment strategy and its success. So we do listen to a lot of different stakeholders as we engage in prioritizing encampments and ensure their safety, but ultimately ensure they're housed.
I would add too, one of the things we've done in Salt Lake is a strategy in terms of pre-planning for any sort of encampment cleanup would be we pick the hot spots with our street outreach teams, all the different providers. We do some housing and homeless resource fairs, bring everybody there to try to engage people in services and reach out to those individuals that are in the encampments. And we've done that, probably 6 times in the last 12 months at least, in some of those hot spots that we're seeing in our downtown area. And that's really helped out to just engage that community and let them know that we're not trying to, force them out, but we want to connect them to services.
I would say finally, the city of Chicago leads the effort for our outreach teams and our shelters and the encampments, but they've reached out. Learning from all of you all in different parts of the country, we started that project called the Accelerated Moving Events, and specifically some data related to that. We started it as part of the pandemic, which we would put all types of advertisements, put the word out through the outreach teams that on this date, we're having an accelerated moving event. Come, we'll help you with identification. They were, took an application, shown 2 options for areas that they wanted to live in the city. They could get keys and get assigned housing that day, as well as a furnished apartment and having mental health, behavioral health professionals there to access services for folks. And then the result of that, during a 2.5-year period that started right at the beginning of the pandemic, we were able to house 1,880 new households using that process. So we're going to carry that on beyond the emergent response of the pandemic. And we are continuing to do those as a way to continue to respond and integrate with our encampments. And I'm really grateful that we haven't had the situation of clean outs and people being overwhelmed with having to find a new place to live.
Francis, I think one of the keys is making sure that the encampment strategies are not to displace, they are to rehome. And we look at them as opportunities, not as nuisances. And we've had great success with that philosophy.
Great. Thanks to all of you. So I'll just pull one more audience question, which is directed for Other Side Village, so Preston, but also I'm happy to hear any other perspectives. The question is simple. For OSV, any success stories working with veterans?
Yeah, so we work closely with our VA, Veterans Administration. There's actually several housing facilities on site at our VA hospital. And so we've worked closely with our recruiting in terms of those that may not want to live there, may want to live in the village in their own cottage style home. Even though those aren't quite yet built, we do have a waiting list of individuals that are interested in that, especially where they've got friends that are in that community and they want to maybe live together and by each other, near each other. So happy to talk offline and maybe connect, more information on that.
Great. Lance, were you going to say something?
No, I'm good.
Okay, this is good because it gives us enough time for, I think, an important question. Of course, the point of the webinar is not just to highlight your work, but also highlight ways that city, state, and federal government can best help scale up, help interventions that are working or that are innovative and bring new things to the table. So just want to ask any and all of you, really, if you have any final advice on how policymakers across all levels of government can best support your efforts to achieve meaningful reductions in homelessness. What would you like to see from any of these levels of government?
I'll jump in real quickly first. One of them is, and Caroline touched on this, touched on this, is reconciling the definition of homelessness at a federal level. I don't think we fully recognize the scale of the issue. We tend to, as a system, deal with someone's problem when they have a problem and not act proactively to avoid them becoming homelessness. And it's just very odd. You would never shovel water out of a boat that's sinking without patching the hole first. And so I think that's one thing. The other one is engaging the private sector. I don't think we do. We have, over the last several years, been perversely blessed, I guess, with extraordinary infusion of capital into the system through COVID funds. And that will end. And engaging other resources, particularly in the private sector, and incentivizing the private sector to provide housing, I think is very, very important. And how we deal with that in the context of competing public purposes, I think it's complicated, but I think something the Bipartisan Center can do a great job at helping facilitate that conversation, because the private sector has essentially unlimited resources should it choose to engage. So that would be my two overriding hopes from these conversations.
I'll dovetail that. And, last week we were in DC as part of the National Alliance to End Homelessness, their effort, and to do Capitol Hill Day. As also, you all know that our legislators are busy trying to put together the THUD bill and other different funding mechanisms. We encourage and push the continued use of those vouchers. We saw great success with that during the last couple of years, and it's nothing wrong with the fact that some of our neighbors need a little bit more of a hand up and some ongoing support until they can get on their own feet. One thing we haven't talked about is just our workforce, to acknowledge the amount of time. And I think, as Chris mentioned earlier, a lot of our workers are just that paycheck away from homelessness themselves, and they continue to show up every day, not really, knowing how to turn some days with just the challenges that they have in their own personal lives. And then just for our, for the bipartisan piece, in Illinois this week, we had a tremendous milestone last September as we met with the governor's office and state legislators, identified the need to prioritize homelessness. So first, the governor put in an executive order, and this week he signed Senate Bill 2138, which permanently establishes statewide interagency council of all the state departments of leadership of departments that can contribute to this. A statewide community advisory board input so that we have a statewide collaboration. And then we also have the establishment of a state homelessness chief. This permanently puts forth the effort by our leadership to support the work that goes into trying to prevent and end homelessness as a priority issue, and it gives it some more permanency. I say that because it's been about 1.5 years, 2-year effort to try to just kind of talk to our legislators and get them to understand this is really important. It doesn't always take just dollars, but dollars are important. It takes also some common thinking and what we're seeing. And so I would really encourage some thought about that.
I would add too, I think there's obviously a kaleidoscope of perspectives in terms of homelessness. One of the things we see in social service and the workforce development is just a lack of individuals that want to enter the workforce and work in this space. And so we have a lack of mental health therapists, social workers, case managers, you name it. It's hiring and retaining those individuals is really, really difficult. And so some sort of education incentives would be welcome in that regard.
Yeah, and I know we're limited for time, so I'll just double down on the workforce development part. And I think really investing in workforce development, and I think for me that means 2 things. One is multi-year contracts. This year-over-year cycle for nonprofits and for other departments is just not sustainable. And then also supporting contracts that pay living wages in our communities. Without that, we're not supporting our workforce.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for your insight. It was lovely to have you on. And this is all the time we have, but I really appreciate all of you coming on and helping to make this such an incredible conversation. So as I mentioned at the top, you can find BPC's work, including our recent blog on local innovative programs addressing homelessness on our website. If this event was of interest to you in the audience, please go to our website and check out our work. I'm sure we'll be producing a lot more in the coming months on the issue of homelessness. And with that, thank you so much again to our speakers for participating in the panel and to our audience for tuning in. I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.